So we're going to get started here. There are some Bibles here for those of you who might need them. We're going to start in Ephesians chapter 4 tonight. And this, what we're talking about tonight, this is really where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. This is where we really come up against it and decide, am I going to truly live my life for Christ? Or am I going to keep going in the same way, the same path that I have been going? So, to read here in Ephesians chapter 4, let me read it with you. You can follow along. So I tell you this, and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. You, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Let me read those last two verses again. To be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So we see here again that Paul, kind of like we talked about earlier, is utilizing this dual mentality, this polar opposites kind of thing, to get his point across. This morning, it was the sinful nature and being controlled by the Spirit. The night before, it was, following the patterns of the world or being transformed. It's this, and he talks about no longer be conformed to the patterns of this world. So it's this. And then this morning, the other example that was in my head, this morning we talked about, the fruit of the Spirit, and it talks about the sins of the flesh and, that list, and then the list of the fruit of the Spirit. So he's utilizing this two-era mentality, this polar opposite kind of thing, to get his point across yet again to the Ephesians. And this time he talks about the old self and the new self. And the thing is that this language that he's using, this metaphor, analogy, whatever you want to call it, that he's using, is like the strongest language he could possibly use. Not necessarily he's not using bad language, but just emphatically trying to get his point across. He spent the book of Ephesians talking to these people, this church, and now he's coming to the point where he just wants to hammer his point into them. And so he uses this analogy of the old self and the new self, and it's just the strongest language that he could use possible, using this idea of these polar opposites. So he talks about the old self, and he says that we, again, no longer should live in that way. If something is old, what does that make it?
Not new.
Not new. The way that it's always been.
Ancient.
Ancient.
Traditional.
Sometimes it can be traditional,
More worn out.
worn out. When we think of things being old, not people, but when we think of things being old, yeah, it's worn out. You know, the way it used to be. That's the old way we did things. And now we want to start talking about new ways. So he talks about, you know, when you lived your life before Christ, before Jesus, you did things in this way, and he calls that the old self. And he says that we should no longer be that way, that those people have futility in their thinking. In other words, the way that they think, the way that they view the world, you could say their worldview, just the way that they process how the world works, is old, and it is futile. In other words, it means it's useless, it's redundant. He says their understanding is darkened. If something is dark, what does that mean it does not have?
Clarity.
Light. Clarity, that's a good one, but light. If something is dark, it means it is absent of light. And the scripture is always talking about how in God there is light. Jesus is the light of the world. So in their understanding, there is no light. It talks about the hardening of the heart, and they are ignorant to the ways of God. They're separated from the life of God. The old self looks inward, only looks to itself. And he says, and this has been used in other passages, that is corrupt, that the old self is corrupted by its evil desires. Now, the thing that I find interesting about this passage is that he doesn't necessarily talk about sin. Like in Galatians this morning, he made this big list of sins. And we said that we could categorize them into all different categories. But here, he doesn't talk about sin. He doesn't say, no longer live like the Gentiles, which was a word that kind of meant separated from God. To get understanding of how this works, back when this was written, there were two kinds of people. There were Jewish people and then everyone else, and they called them Gentiles. Well, then when Jesus came on the scene and created the church, made the church, both Jews and Gentiles were coming to know Christ. And so it became this way of referring to non-Christian people, or non-religious people, I guess you could say, calling them Gentiles. Not only was it a term that defined this as a people group, but now it's a kind of people group, those who are completely devoid of God. And so when he says, you must no longer live like Gentiles, people without God, and then he gives the list, but he doesn't say you should no longer live like Gentiles, people without God, and stop doing all of these sins. What does he say? What does he talk about? He says you should no longer live like the Gentiles do. What? What's the next words? In the futility of their what? Thinking. You should no longer live like people who do not know God in the futility of their thinking. Paul addresses the real problem here. It's not sin. Sin is the result of the real problem. And the problem is having a mind that is not pointed towards God, like we talked about this morning. Sin is the malfunction of our mind. It is the malfunction of our incorrect thinking. Paul does not focus on sin here. He focuses on a person's thinking, the distorted, dysfunctional mind. That's why, guys, that's why this is so important. The way that we think affects the way that we live. And if we do not renew our minds, if we do not start thinking the way that Jesus says we should think, the problem is just going to continue. So he goes on to talk about the new self. And again, it is the complete opposite. It is a person who denies their self, does not look inward, but looks towards God. All that shapes their thinking, their opinions, their attitudes, flows down from Jesus. All of their thoughts come from a turning of their mind towards Christ. Salvation, the very essence of salvation, is a complete restructuring of a person's thinking. This is kind of like you know how identity theft is kind of a big thing in our day? This is kind of a change in your identity, a change in your mental identity. You no longer identify the way that you used to, because now when you come to Christ, mentally you identify with him. Mentally you identify with Jesus. So let's talk about this. What are thoughts that you have? What are attitudes that you have? What are your opinions on different subjects? Do they come from Christ? Or do they come from you in your, and I'm not saying this to offend anyone, we're all in the same boat here. Do they come from your distorted, dysfunctional, sin-riddled mind? Let me give you an example of this. Very, very recent thing. So, I'm hoping that many of you have seen the news enough to know about this whole refugee thing that is going on. So, at first, okay, my first thought was when the thing in Paris happened, the terrorist attack in Paris happened, and we came to realize that these terrorists were infiltrating Syrian refugees and just making their way around the world to wreak havoc and stuff. Well, the very next day, just to give you guys the story so you know what's going on. It might not have been the next day, but Monday, we'll say, the United States said we still want to plan on taking in these refugees. And a lot of governors came out and said, my state will not allow these refugees into the state. Some said yes. In Pennsylvania, Governor Wolf said that we would allow these refugees in. Okay, so that's the story. So my initial thoughts, when this all, the story was breaking and everything, my first thought was, there is no way we should be taking in these guys. No way we should be taking in these refugees because we don't know who they are. There's no way of telling who they are, and all these terrorists are going to come in, and it won't be safe for us. It will be a bad situation. As far as I was thinking myself, as far as I go protecting my family and whatnot, we have no idea who these people are. We have no idea how we're going to, be able to protect ourselves if these guys, infiltrate or whatever and they come in. So I was totally against it, completely, 100%. That was my opinion. Those were my thoughts, my attitude towards the situation. And then I had a conversation with a very wise woman, my wife, because she had thought a lot about this. And I made a comment on Facebook for something that somebody posted. I don't even really remember doing it, but she had obviously saw it and read it. And so we were in our kitchen the other day, and she said, I just want you to know that I am pro-refugee, which is so stupid that we now have to have these I'm anti-refugee, I'm pro-refugee kind of labels. That's just ridiculous to me. But we sat down and talked. And by the way, I was in the middle of coming up with these, like writing out these lessons and, in our sessions. So I knew that we were talking about how we think, our thinking process, okay? So she says to me, in regards to this situation, I don't want to get to heaven and have Jesus look at me and say, when I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. When I was homeless, you did not open your home to me. And I realized in the midst of our conversation that my thinking about this was totally wrong. Now, I am not trying, it is not my job to persuade anyone's opinion about anything.
You make me sad. I should tear up there. Like, what the heck happened?
I am trying to point out that our thoughts and our opinions need to flow from Christ. Is there a possibility that if we allow these people into the country, terrorists will come and bad things will happen? Yes, of course there is. But there is also the possibility that in the midst of that chaos, we could bring people in and feed them and clothe them and give them a safe place to live. Because Jesus says that our purpose on this earth, we talked about this in our small group this morning. When I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was homeless, you gave me a place to stay. Do you guys see what I mean? Our thinking, our opinions about everything need to come from Christ, because if it's left up to us, we will think the wrong thing and miss opportunities to show people love. And that's what Paul is talking about when he says that we need to put on the new self. This passage is talking about action, taking action. It's talking about saying we are no longer going to just talk about following Christ. We are going to do it. To put off something and to put on something else requires action. It requires movement. And so this is where each one of us needs to look at ourselves and say, what are the things in my life that I need to get rid of that are holding me back from following Christ, taking off the old self? And what are the things that I need to bring into my life, put on the new self? Turn with me to the book of Colossians real quick, in chapter 3. Paul says this, I'll read it while you guys are turning to it. Since then you have been raised with Christ. If we are raised with Christ, what does that mean that happened previously? What do you think? What do you think?
What was the question? I was trying to find
If we are raised with Christ, what happened before that? we died to ourselves. So, since we have died to ourselves, we are raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. And he says this in verse 3. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. What? Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. My friends, this life, what we see and experience here, is only extremely temporary. Is only temporary. There is a life, true life, beyond this world that we will one day, if we have given our lives to Jesus, we will one day experience. And in order for us to renew our minds, in order for us to have the correct thinking that we need to live out our relationship with Christ, we have to do what this passage says. We have to set our minds and our hearts on things that are above. In other words, this word set is very similar to the word that was used earlier, where it talks about pointing our direction. We need to point our focus, point our direction towards things above. And that phrase that he uses there, it means heavenly things. It means, God things. It means Jesus things. We can put it that way. We need to set our minds and our hearts on things above. Let me give you an example. Most of you know this, I love the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I love all the movies. I do love pizza too. I love all the movies. I love, just all the things that they have. So I get really excited. I get really excited when, new things come out and I really want to see it. So this past Friday, Netflix teamed up with Marvel again, and they put out this new miniseries, Jessica Jones. I was so excited to see it. And on the way, I guess when we were driving, I don't know a whole lot about the storyline, which is why I was excited to watch it. But I found out, reading reviews and stuff about it, that it is, A, extraordinarily violent. And B, there are really explicit sex scenes in this show.
Ew.
And so now I have to think, do I want to, for my love of Marvel and all the things that, are connected there, do I want to put that over my relationship with Christ and watch this purely for my entertainment? Do I want to fill my mind with those things just so I can be entertained for an hour? Well, I guess really it's 13 or 130 hours. I don't know, 13 hours. 13 hours. Because there are 13 episodes, 1 hour each. I don't know why I was...
130 hours.
I can't do math. So, do I want to be entertained? Do I want to set my mind on that earthly thing and set my heart on that earthly thing just so I can be entertained for 13 hours? Or for my relationship with Christ? Do I want to forget about that and set my mind and my heart on things that are above? Things that actually matter. Things that actually matter. Because here's the thing. If all of this is temporary, how long is it going to last? Not very long. But if the things of God are permanent, if the things of Christ are eternal, should we not focus on those things? Because that's what really matters in the end. My friends, I gotta tell you, I'm not coming down on high school, and I'm not telling you to drop out or anything. Or do acid. None of that. I should have paused that before I said that. Yeah. None of that. But the things that you are experiencing right now in school, forget about eternity. In 5 years, who was the valedictorian? Who was the class clown? Who had the best car? Who had the best clothes? Who had this boyfriend or that girlfriend or whatever? It's not going to matter at all. Not one bit. But here's the thing. Your relationship with Christ, it is going to matter in 5 years. It's going to matter in 10 years, in 20, 50 years. It's a matter of where you and I are going to spend eternity. It's a matter of where we're going to spend eternity. Is it going to be in the presence of God? Because while here on this earth, we set our hearts and our minds on things that actually mattered? Or is it going to be apart from God because we got so consumed with all of the stuff of this world that we said no to God and no to Christ over and over and over? Guys, you all have such an opportunity because you are young. You have such an opportunity to have a vibrant relationship with Christ now. To have such a great relationship with Christ now that will carry you through your entire life. Whether you choose to just go right to the working or in the military or college or whatever. If you work on your relationship with Christ now and forget about all of this earthly junk, this can carry you through life, your life here on earth. I remember when I was your age, I was in church one Sunday, and one of the traditions of our church is we had one of the church members come up and say like the opening prayer. And this guy named George Spees came up. And it was his turn, I guess, to do the opening prayer that Sunday. And I remember he just gave this 1 minute talk or whatever before he prayed. But one of the things he said was, when I was in high school, I heard somebody say, I wish when I was younger, I would have followed Christ more closely. And he said, when he was a teen, he thought, that won't be me. I'm going to make the right decisions. I'm going to make the right decisions and follow Christ through high school. And as I'm sitting here today, he stood up at that podium and said, I wish when I was younger, I would have followed Christ more closely. And I remember sitting in that pew thinking to myself, can anyone guess what I was thinking? That won't be me. I'm going to make the right decisions. I'm going to follow Christ. And as I'm sitting here in front of you, I wish when I was your age, I would have followed Christ more closely. Because I put myself through a whole bunch of crap. because I said yes to myself and no to Christ. My friends, you guys have such an opportunity here this weekend, to make a commitment to yourself, to make a commitment to Christ. That you are no longer going to live life your way, but tonight you're going to start doing things God's way. Tonight, you can make the choice to say no to yourself and renew your mind and start following Christ more closely. I want to take just a few moments and just have some quiet time. I'm going to play a song just so we have some background music. But I want you to take just a few moments of quiet and examine yourself and where you are in your walk with Jesus. And ask yourself, do I need to, tonight, renew my mind and put off the old self and put on the new self? I just want to take a few moments. And here's the thing. If you feel a necessity to really make a decision, to make progress in your relationship with Christ tonight, in these moments of quiet, Kylie, I'm going to steal that chair from you. I'm going to use this chair and this. I would invite you to just come up front here and just bow your knees and just pray to God. And tell him what's on your mind. If you need to do, as we say, some business with him and confess some things to him, now is the opportunity for you to do it. And while you're up here, I'm going to just pray with you. So I just want to take a few moments. And so you don't have to close your eyes, but let's not talk to our neighbors or anything. But let's just bow our heads and bow our hearts and just take a few moments and talk to our Lord, talk to God, and let's just examine ourselves